Absolutely. Thank you so much again. All right. So next up, we have our next presenter is Neffertia Tyner. Neffertia is the Assistant Community Coordinator with Kansas State University. Neffertia, if you are ready to go, you can go ahead and share your screen. There we go. All right, and I'll turn it on over to you.
Hey, hello everyone. Oops, I think it went. Okay. Hello everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come to this presentation. Like previously mentioned, my name is Neffertia. I use she, her pronouns. I do identify as a Black queer woman, and so that'll be important like later on as we get further into the presentation. And so we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm going to be talking to you about how messy it can sometimes be working with students, whether it be you trying to support them when you don't share the same background or aren't exactly well equipped or not really knowledgeable of their specific background, or more importantly, as this presentation relates to how sometimes if you have a marginalized identity, how working with a student with differing values or beliefs that directly negatively impact your identity can sometimes be hard, and how to kind of work through that and sort of give you some self-care tools. The motivation for me doing this topic was reflecting on my experience from undergrad and grad school now, whether it been like presenters, seminars, webinars, professors, like anybody who I can talk to. I asked them some form of how do I continue to support students and also protect myself as a queer person of color? And so, okay, so this is an overview. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information about the conceptual foundation. And so just like a theory that has really like motivated this presentation, things to honestly reflect on. So 3 questions that I came up with to reflect on personally and professionally. An activity that I just randomly thought of one day. I was struggling to kind of connect with one of my students. And so I just sat down and did this activity, and I found it to be really helpful. And so I hope it can be helpful for you as you move forward in your career. And then we're going to move into networking, support, and ethics. And then we're going to wrap it up with the idea of radical self-care. So the conceptual foundation. So this, the racial battle fatigue is the theory that is really like behind this. And so for those of you who are not familiar, I'm just going to read it straight off the slide. So it is defined as the constant physiological, cultural, and emotional coping with racial microaggressions and racially hostile or unsupportive environments. And so I did put a little note in here that says, even though the theory does focus on racism, the overarching concept of it can be applied to other marginalized identities. So whether it's class status, gender identity, expression, sexuality, any marginalized identity this theory can apply to. And so Husband explains that the constant use or redirection of energy needed to cope with mundane racism depletes the energy needed for other aspects of our personal or professional lives. So basically this kind of says, if you're in a meeting where one of your identities was attacked or impacted, and now you have 5 minutes to kind of gather yourself and move on to sit in like a one-on-one with the staff member or lead a team meeting or anything, or for grad students going to class. If you're still trying to gather yourself and trying to cope with what just happened, there's no way you can put 100% of yourself into that class or into that meeting with that student or into that team meeting. So these are 3 questions that I randomly came up with one day. So the first question, what are some life experiences that may influence how you support or interact with students? And so with this, it's really important to be honest with yourself. And so for me, example, I really looked at my undergrad experience. And so there were like a number of occasions where I was called the N-word on campus, on or off campus. And so taking that experience into now, that's going to reflect on if I have to meet with the student who might have thrown that word out there. And so that's going to impact like how I'm able to support that student and how I'm able to kind of go about that meeting. And I have actually done that, and that'll be like later on in the presentation. I'll share more about that story. The second question, what are your boundaries when it comes to the identities that you hold? So we're people. We're allowed to have emotions, feelings, triggers, and boundaries. And so it's important to identify those boundaries that you have early. And so those things where you might have to take a step back and reach out to a coworker or a colleague and say, hey, can you kind of pick up where I left off? And so being honest about where your boundaries are when it comes to your identity. And what are some triggers? And so what are some things that are going to be hurtful for you in case those situations come up? So kind of for like a little preface for this activity is one of our leadership team members here at Kansas State, Dr. Kevin Cook. He always mentioned things about like having raggedy thoughts and like sitting with that. And so through this activity, if you're being honest, there is a possibility that you are going to have raggedy thoughts throughout this. And so if you're able to access information about student orgs at your current institution or your future institution, if you're planning on leaving in like a couple weeks or a month or so, look at that campus involvement sheet and kind of go through the student orgs and make a list of any orgs you may personally find hard to work with. And if you don't kind of want to look at the student orgs, you can look at like personalities or different traits or like student groups or anything like that. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be student orgs. So one of my non-student orgs where I kind of find it hard for students to work with students who can't necessarily like tough out a situation. And so from that, I recognize that childhood experiences, life experience, is where I came like to kind of like that thinking. And so going back to the previous presentation, kind of reflecting on like your life experiences and reflecting on like why you chose that student org or why you chose that population and recognizing that. And so that's a regular thought that I have because not everyone grew up the way I grew up, right? And so not everyone is going to be able to like tough out, and I'm doing air quotes, like tough out a situation. And so just being honest with yourself and then thinking about your boundaries and your triggers, developing a plan to work with and support these students because we are professionals and that is our job. And so if this student comes to you, how will you be able to work with them and how will you be able to support them? So the network support and ethics, as far as networking, find mentors who will be honest with you and who you can be honest with, who you can go to and say, hey, I'm really struggling having this conversation, or I'm really struggling supporting this student, and kind of seeing if they have any similar experiences or same experiences that they can, you can bounce ideas off of, and you can like work through that. Identifying allies outside of your department. And so some of us may work in small departments, and so you don't necessarily want to talk to the same people in your department about different things every day, especially if you kind of find yourself in the position of like having those raggedy thoughts. Like sometimes that can be like kind of embarrassing and you don't really want to admit that. And so finding people outside of your department who you trust, who you can talk to about those situations. And it's also a really great thing to develop those relationships outside of your department because them working in another aspect of student affairs, they can probably provide a different perspective from working in a different area. And so that may help you out and it might help them out. And building connections with campus resources. And so our campus resources isn't just for our students, it can be for us as well. And so if you're really struggling through something, or if there's a student who you don't share the same background with and you want to learn more, you can reach out to your campus resources in different offices and say, I need support in this area, or I'm trying to learn more about this. Can I ask you some questions? For the support piece, direct and indirect support. So first I'm going to start with the indirect support. And so I've kind of characterized this as when you need to take a step back and refer the student on. And I used to say like pass the student off, and I really checked myself about that, because you're not passing the student off. You're referring the student on to either protect yourself and protect your identities, or because you've realized that you're not equipped enough to support that student at the level that they need to be supported. And so I'm going to provide two examples of this. So one example, like I said before, I had a conduct hearing where these two students, they were binge watching a British show, and the British show was using the word knickers to refer to like pants, but they were using that word to substitute it for something else. And they said it around one of my Black female staff members. She really got upset. And it was really, in the beginning, it was hard for me because I share the same identity with my staff member. And I also knew how it felt when I heard the word myself as an undergrad. And so I was able to have that meeting with those students, and the conversation was great, but it didn't stop the anxiousness, and it didn't stop me not eating for the whole day because I was so nervous about like what was going to happen. Like, was I going to say something wrong, or was the student going to say something wrong? And the conversation escalated. Like, none of that stopped. But using my tips from networking, like I was able to identify a coworker who volunteered to take the case. If she said, if I wanted to pass the case on, I could pass it to her. And she 100% understood like why I would need to do that. And so that's an example of me having to take a step back to protect my identity so I can continue to do my job and support my students. The other example is I had another RA who her religious identity is really important to her. And she was trying to bond with a student whose lifestyle she didn't necessarily agree with. And so there was like some kind of like internal conflict there. And she came to me to talk about it. And as she was talking about it, I could tell that she wanted to really get deep into the conversation. And I didn't grow up religious. And coming into grad school, I didn't have a strong knowledge of religious identity as it relates to students. And so I wasn't comfortable taking her into that conversation or having that conversation with her when I knew she needed something deeper. And so we sat down, I helped her identify some professors, staff members, and people in her religious organization who she really trusted to go talk to and have those conversations. And I was honest with her and just said, where you're looking to go, I know I can't provide that support for you. And so me helping you identify people who can support you like is a way for me to provide like some level of care for you. And it turned out great. She said she had a great conversation, but I told her like, if that didn't work out, you can come back to me and we can figure it out. And so that's an example of me providing indirect support as it relates to like me recognizing that what that student needed at that point in time, I couldn't provide. And with that, it's also my responsibility to educate myself more about religious identity as it relates to student. And I have done that since my first year of grad school. And so this GIF here, it was supposed to play, but it isn't playing. But it is a GIF of like P. Diddy, and I think the guy's name is Elijah, and they're basically staring each other down. And so if you're meeting with a student whose beliefs is going to impact your identity, and it is going to hurt you, trying to push through or tough out that conversation isn't going to be helpful for neither you nor the student. And so you might end up sitting in the office like staring each other down, and that just isn't productive. And so the directive support is just the typical like one-on-one meetings, being able to guide the student from point A to point B. And so I just wanted to differentiate those two. As far as ethics, so one of our CAST principles is non-malfeasance, and is basically we pledge to do no harm. And so we pledge to provide a supportive and educational environment for all of our students. And so, like I said in the beginning, at the end of the day, we are student affairs professionals, and we do have a duty to support all of our students, period. But that support doesn't necessarily have to be the typical direct support. It can be the indirect support as long as it's intentional. As long as you're not saying, well, go to counseling services or go to X, Y, and Z. Like, who in counseling services would best support the student, or who in this office, or what faculty member would be able to have this conversation with that student? And so to wrap up, I'm going to wrap up with the idea of radical self-care. And so your health is your top priority, and without it, nothing else is possible. And so this is going back to the first slide. If you're not taking care of yourself, you're not putting 100% into supporting your students, doing your job, paying attention in classes. And so these are 3 questions to kind of move towards radical self-care. So what does your mind need? What does your body need? And what does your spirit need? So cutting out time in your day to be able to sit down and check in with yourself, and giving yourself permission to say, I'm really hurt by this. I need to take the afternoon off. Or maybe you might need to take the day off, or maybe don't go to the weekend program that your student put on. So really checking in on yourself. And so this is a quote that I threw in by Audre Lorde: "Caring for yourself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." And so just recognizing that we often preach to our students that you're a student first, well, you're a person first, and then you're a student, and then you're a staff member. So the same thing applies to us. We're people first, and then we're staff members. And so we have to take care of ourselves and of who we are. So that's all that I have for you. Thank you again for taking time to come to this presentation. If you have any questions, you can put it in the chat. If later on you have any other questions, you can always email me. If you want to kind of continue this conversation, that's my personal email address. I'm 100% open to having conversations. I'm also really big on feedback, and I really appreciate it. So if you have time, here's a QR code. And then I am going to, okay. And then off to the side is the link to the feedback if you need the link.
Thank you so much, Neffertia, for a wonderful presentation. If anyone has questions, go ahead and you can either unmute yourself or feel free to put it in the chat.
Neffertia, thank you so much for such a great presentation. I think the one piece that I wanted to comment on that I thought was really important that you mentioned is how we see ourselves as people first and staff second. And I don't think that that's always the reality of what people experience or the expectation that gets put out there. So I appreciate you bringing that up as something that we have to prioritize in our own self-care and how we move forward.
Yes, of course.
Okay, seeing no questions in the chat. Thank you again so much, Neffertia, for a wonderful presentation. We're going to transition to our next section of our conference sessions today, which is our chatty hour session. So everyone